In the 19th century, in our industrial age, one of the most important ideas was that human life was controlled by enormous forces, powers, if you like, that we had no control over. Each individual's destiny was controlled by things like history and economics, as Marx described in our last big idea, Marxism. But in the 19th century, people like Marx began to understand how those things could be changed, how the process worked, and therefore give people power again over their own lives. And exactly the same was true with this week's big idea, represented by the icon here. And here's the original of that. It's a cartoon from a magazine called The Hornet. And the cartoon is labeled A Venerable Orang-Utang, a contribution to unnatural history. And we'll recognise the word orangutan spelt slightly differently in the Victorian era, and we know that an orangutan is one of the great apes. It is represented here on the right-hand side, able to manipulate things with its feet, for example. But of course, this orangutan has an entirely different head, a different face from any other orangutan, because its face is that of the naturalist Charles Darwin, who you might recognise here. And Charles Darwin was a naturalist who contributed to natural history, and his discoveries were among the most important scientific discoveries of all time. And they affected not just science, but politics and ethics as well, and theology, for that matter, as we'll find out in a minute. So he made very important contributions to natural history, but the cartoonist or satirist here is ridiculing him. He dresses Darwin up as the orangutan because his reading of the theory is that Darwin had in some ways said that human beings and other types of apes and primates are basically the same. Now, that's an unsophisticated reading of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, but kind of true nevertheless. And so he calls him a venerable orangutan because Darwin has been venerated, he's been looked up to, he's been respected by other people. And the cartoonist here is undermining that reputation. He thinks Darwin's ideas are probably ridiculous, so he makes Darwin look ridiculous, and he makes his idea look as if it's something that's absolutely impossible. What, an orangutan with the head of a scientist? Surely there's a bigger difference between human beings and other species than that, says the cartoonist. So our big idea this week is evolution, and as I've said, it's one of those ideas that describes forces beyond our control that make us the way we are. In evolutionary theory, we have come to understand how all species are the way they are, and how there is no purpose or design to it. It's simply a brute fact of the universe. There is a process within our natural world that makes it so. There's nothing we can do about it, and how we've evolved is well beyond our control. But it's not beyond our understanding, and scientists today, of course, through things like genetic engineering, have begun to master the process of evolution as well. The word evolution comes from Latin, and the prefix a means out of, e or x in Latin, and volu is to do with turning. So this word, as you can see, is just like revolution or devolution or involve or solve. They all have the same root, which is to do with turning. But whereas revolution is turning back on itself, a major turnaround or upheaval, evolution is a gradual change out of one state into another, a gradual change, not a radical change. So we've introduced the idea of evolution, gradual change, as described by Darwin, natural selection, and a process that controls us that we have no control over. The biologist Theodosius Dvansky wrote in an essay designed to argue against creationism that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. He said this because evolution is responsible for the characteristics and behavior of all the species alive on our planet, including our own. Now, creationism is an idea held by a very small number within Christianity. that it is wrong to accept the truth of evolution because it contradicts a particular interpretation of the Christian Bible story, such as the details about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And biologists like Dobzhansky wanted to reject this notion out of hand. If biology only makes sense because of evolution, then rejecting evolution means that we have to reject the whole of biology, and that's a nonsense. So we already see that there is some kind of conflict here between scientific interpretations and some religious interpretations of the beginnings of the universe or as the origins of humanity. The theory of evolution was first proposed by two men, Charles Darwin and the lesser-known Alfred Russel Wallace. Both men developed their theory independently based on evidence, such as observations of different species from their expeditions around the world, as well as selective breeding of plants and animals by farmers. Their studies of the fossil record collected by people such as Mary Anning also showed that some species had become extinct, while others had clearly changed over time. So the theory of evolution is a scientific theory, and that does not mean that it might not be true or it's just a guess. It means it's the best available explanation based on scientific evidence and rigorous thinking about that evidence. And Darwin and Russell came up with this theory at around about the same time and more or less independently of each other. And that goes to show that the theory of evolution was building on science that had gone before. It was a sort of inevitable consequence of the way the world is that we would start to understand it a little bit better and find out what the processes were. Darwin and Wallace used their evidence as the basis for the theory that all organisms had evolved from a single common ancestor by a random process, natural selection. Imagine a population of giraffes with different sized necks living in a habitat with very tall trees. You might think that a giraffe could choose to change and grow a longer neck to reach the leaves and pass on this ability to its offspring. This was an idea proposed by a man called Lamarck in 1801. But his suggestion was rejected because there was no evidence to show that parents could pass on changes that occur in their lifetime to their offspring, or that an organism could affect not just its behavior, but its physical characteristics. The Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection states that only those giraffes who already had long necks would survive and therefore reproduce and pass on their traits onto their offspring. Over time, all the members of the giraffe species would have long necks. Biologists now know that this is because the offspring inherit DNA from their parents. It wasn't something Darwin knew about, but later science has proved him fundamentally right. Although we now accept the theory of evolution, when Darwin first published his book On the Origin of Species in 1859, he was ridiculed, as you can see in the cartoon. This is firstly because people did not fully understand Darwin's theory and thought he said we had evolved from apes. This is not true, although we do share a common ancestor and 96% of our DNA. The ridicule was also because people feared this idea. It challenged the idea that God designed our world for humans, as it demonstrated that nature designs itself, and humans are similar to all other forms of life, not separate. It also made people begin to ask whether ethics should be based on the same ideas, survival of the fittest, rather than compassion for the weakest. It's worth just looking again at those problems brought up by Darwin's theory for theology and political ethics. Religions teach that God designed the universe, and then in some ways human beings are the summit, the peak of that creation. But the theory of evolution says that we now understand how nature designs itself, and there is no need or room for God involved in that process. And it also says that there's really not that much special about human beings. We're just another species that has adapted in another way. In terms of ethics, And this became known in some circles as social Darwinism. In terms of ethics, Darwin's theory seemed to imply that it was really good to outcompete your rivals, to survive at their cost, perhaps. That maybe violence and fighting things out was a good thing. And Hitler's race scientists took this idea on, saying that there should be war, there should be conflict, and weaker versions of human beings should be eliminated because it would help us progress and evolve. Not an idea that, of course, Darwin would have shared, but a perversion of it by the Nazis. So Darwinism really has affected the whole of the 20th century and modern era, not just in terms of biology and medical science and the advances we see there, but in the way that we think about ourselves and, of course, our environment. Make sure you complete the online quiz and the comprehension questions. And this week's big question is this: describe what it means to be human. So I want you to think specifically about what it means to be human as opposed to some other kind of creature. And it's not just the fact that maybe your cat has claws and you have fingernails. It's something a little bit deeper than that. So you could think about some of the questions here. Are human beings different to other creatures? Are we special? Are we unique? So, for example, we know that human beings have only been in existence for about 250,000 years. What's so special about us? Are we just really chimps with bigger brains, but we're not as good at climbing? And perhaps you could answer the question just by answering the last of these questions, if you like. How would you define what a human is, as opposed to every other form of life, to an alien visitor? If an alien from outer space came to Earth and said, "What are you?" and you said, "I'm a human," and he said, "What's a human?" well, what would you say?